Now, I want to challenge you to think practically in your own life of those things that might fall under that category for you. What are the things that you're perfectly okay, I think it's fine that I'm doing this, I have the liberty to do these things, but maybe there's somebody watching me, maybe there's somebody who knows me, who believes this is a sin, and is being led to violate their conscience because they've seen you do it, they've seen me do it. And so they proceeded even though their conscience still tells them you shouldn't do that. And so the sin is not eating meat. The sin is not drinking the wine, smoking the cigar, watching the movie. The sin is when I have led somebody to violate their conscience in that area. And so what do we do about that? Well, we start by looking at the danger that knowledge possesses. And I want to preface it with this. Knowledge is good. We should be growing. We should be the ones jumping into the polar plunge. We should immerse ourselves fully in the Word of God. But we need to approach it with this understanding that knowledge can be dangerous, not simply for us, but for those around us. And so we begin with the danger of knowledge, that is that it tends to produce arrogance. We become very arrogant the more we know. Whether it's in Bible study, whether it's in an area that you work in education, whatever it is, the more you grow, the more you know, there is this arrogance that comes along with it. And like I said earlier, man, we are filled with that in the world today. Those who, in their arrogance, know better for you than what you know for you. And so that tends to breed that arrogance, and Paul warns them of that. That is being, you're going to be a stumbling block for somebody because you're in your arrogance paying no attention to the effects of what you're doing on somebody else in your life. The second thing is the danger of knowledge is that it tends to produce a lack of self-awareness. It creates a blind spot in our life. We know and we grow, and the more we know and the more we grow, the less we are able to see the things that we don't know. We begin to think that we know all things, and those little areas of our life that maybe there's an absence of knowledge, we don't even notice that anymore. We don't notice the imperfection because we are just so immersed in ourselves and growing and knowing. And so we create blind spots that we're unable to see in our own life the problems that exist. We might want to point out the problems in somebody else's life, but we can't even recognize it in our own life. Now, most of you will know the name Charles Spurgeon, great preacher from England in the late 1800s. And Charles Spurgeon, you look anywhere online, you can find his sermons today just listed everywhere. Prolific sermon writer. And he was very protective of his pulpit. And there was only one guy, like in England, that he would allow to share his pulpit with him. And he would let him come and speak every once in a while. And then one day, Spurgeon found out that this guy went to the theater. Now, remember, the theater in those days wasn't a movie. It would be a play of some kind. But he found out that this other preacher went to the theater. Well, that moment, that guy was cut off from the pulpit. He was not going to be speaking at his church anymore. And so Spurgeon was this very ritualistic guy. He had a schedule that he kept. And you go online, you look it up, and you could find everything he did every day. This is the day that he wrote his sermons. This is the day he prayed. This is the day. He did all these things. And one of the things that he records is that he was a cigar smoker. He loved to enjoy a cigar. And each week, when he would ride his carriage to the church, he would say this. He said this in his biography. He said, "Smoke a cigar to the glory of God." That's what he would do. Smoke a cigar to the glory of God. So Spurgeon at one time invited D.L. Moody to come and speak at his church. Now D.L. Moody was a famous evangelist from Chicago and was doing these mass evangelism crusades, many people coming to Christ because of the ministry of D.L. Moody. And so Moody came to his church. He knew this about Spurgeon. So what do you think he preached on that day? He spent the entire day talking about the dangers and the hazards of tobacco. and how Christians should have nothing to do with tobacco. And so when the sermon was over and Spurgeon went up onto the stage, he said to Moody, he said, "Mr. Moody, I will put down my cigar when you put down your fork." Dwight Moody was overweight. He was obese. And so both of them had these blind spots. They didn't see their own issues, but they could see the issues of other people. And so when we grow in knowledge, we tend to develop blind spots. We're unable to see things in our own life, and the writer here, Paul, speaks of that. In fact, you don't even see that anymore. You don't even notice that in your own life. And so we need to be aware of that as we consider the danger that knowledge possesses. And again, does that mean we don't attempt to grow in knowledge? No, it doesn't mean that. But it means we need to be careful about that. As we immerse ourselves in one Bible study after the other, and we are pursuing to know Jesus deeper and deeper and greater, we're growing and growing, and yet there can become this arrogance and this lack of self-awareness that's present. And so what do we do about that? What is it? Is the call then to just stop growing? Is that what he wants? Well, I think it's very obvious here that the answer is found in love. And it is that love is going to be that which tempers our knowledge. And so we continue to grow in knowledge. We should pursue it with all our effort and all our strength, but never at the expense, at the cost of not loving God or loving people. And so we look at this maybe, and we tend to look at things like this from the Old and New Testament, food sacrificed to idols, and we look at that and we immediately just check out. We're like, well, that isn't relevant to us today. But here's the thing. We live in a culture that is saturated in idolatry. We don't have temples anymore. We got stadiums. We have TV sets. We got all these other things now that we've elevated to idolatry status. We don't need to sacrifice to the temple. We can just, burn some wings on Sunday afternoon during the football game. We have our own means of just replaced our idolatry with a new form of idolatry. Maybe more dangerous because we don't even recognize it as idolatry anymore. And so we, in our idolatry-saturated culture, we face difficult choices in areas of our Christian liberty. And I don't want to in any way just present this like, oh, it's easy, it's simple. Just grow a little bit more knowledgeable and you'll know. It's always going to be challenging to make the right choices. And we're going to see why. Because even if I have the Christian liberty to make a decision, I do not have the liberty to make that decision if it has a negative impact on somebody else. If I'm going to cause someone else to stumble, no, I don't have the liberty to do that. And so we make these difficult choices. And it's God's word that produces knowledge that enables the less mature to experience liberty. So why do I say that? Because here's what's important. So I'm preaching to all of you today probably at various levels of maturity in your relationship with God. Some of you feel very comfortable in your Christian liberty. You feel very good about the choices that you make, the things that God is fine with you doing. And there's others of you that maybe you're at the other spectrum that are still pretty cautious in making those decisions, that you're really not feel that I really should be doing this. And so you refrain from those things. Or if you don't refrain, you have this burning sense of guilt in your consciousness. And so all of us are at that place. So what do we do as a Christian? What do we do as a church? Well, my goal is to bring you all to a level of Christian maturity so that you all can live in the Christian liberty that God intends for you. And so I'm preaching this message today so that those of you that are not mature in your faith and are not able to exercise Christian liberty as God would intend for you, that you're able to get to that place of maturity and liberty in your life. And so we teach with that in mind, that we elevate our knowledge so that we can experience liberty as intended. We don't squelch knowledge. We don't quit attempting to grow. We continue to elevate everyone in their level of maturity. But the problem becomes that it is this, that your Christian liberty is going to have an impact on other people in your life. Whether it's your children, whether it's your coworkers, people in your church, the way that you exercise your liberty, the choices that you make about what's right and what's wrong and those gray areas is going to affect other people in your life. And so that needs to be taken into consideration. Romans chapter 14 is probably the greatest chapter in the Bible on Christian liberty. And we're not in Romans chapter 14. We're obviously in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, but I'm going to reference Romans chapter 14. And I would encourage you, I'm just going to read a couple of verses out of it. But if your interest is piqued, I'd encourage you to read all of Romans 14 sometime this week. But Romans chapter 14, verse 1 says this: "Accept other believers who are weak in faith and don't argue with them about what they think is right or wrong." Here's what we do in areas of Christian liberty. We think that it's okay to do this, or we think that it's not okay to do this. And since you and I have a different opinion about that, what do we try to do? Well, we try to convince the other person that they're wrong. So we get in these debates. We get in these arguments. Now, again, I'll go back. Teaching the Word of God, helping people to grow in their faith, that is the means by which people are elevated in maturity and to a new sense of personal Christian liberty. But we don't endlessly argue and tell people they're wrong. It's no value, Paul says in his letter to the Romans. And so we're not going to have it's not going to be valuable for us to do that, because what we're doing when we do that is this: we're leaving love out. Here's what he said. He says, here's the answer. The answer is always love. It's loving people. It's loving God and it's loving people. And so if my concern in living my Christian liberty is simply me convincing you that you're wrong, I'm not showing love. I show love by being concerned the effect that what I believe might have on your life. If I'm convincing you something and you still hold to your conviction that this is wrong, I've accomplished nothing. In fact, I've accomplished something detrimental, because now you're more likely to participate in something that you're convinced is sin. And so we see that Christian liberty must always be tempered by love. Rupertus Meldenius said this: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. There's been a lot of different people who have been quoted to have said that, but I believe this is the guy that most likely said it. But he really summarizes what we're talking about here. There's things that we have to be in ultimate agreement on. What does the Bible say? That's the essentials. In those essentials, we got unity. Now, there's other areas that we're in disagreement on, those gray areas, those areas that the Bible doesn't speak specifically about. And in those areas, in those differences, in those places, those non-essentials, then it's liberty. You decide what you believe is right, and I decide what I believe is right. I exercise my Christian liberty with that. But he says this at the end, which really brings it all together: in all things, charity. And charity is love. It means no matter which decision I make, this has to be bathed in love. I have to live this out with an understanding that I have to love you in the choice that I make. I have to show love to you in the choice I make. And the reason that that's so critical is that what happens is this: when a believer violates their personal conscience, they are engaged in sin. When a believer violates their personal conscience, they are engaged in sin. Now, I'm going to go back. I'm just going to use Charles Spurgeon as the example. Charles Spurgeon had the Christian liberty to smoke a cigar for the glory of God. But if in doing that, he led somebody else to do that who would become enslaved to that, somebody who was convinced it was sinful, but the preacher did it so I can do it, then what has happened is that person has sinned. Not that smoking a cigar is a sin, but that you have violated your conscience about that. That's the sin. And so understanding that gives us great responsibility in terms of the way we live out our Christian liberty. Back to Romans chapter 14. We looked at the first verse. Let's look at the last verse, verse 23. But if you have doubts about whether or not you should eat something, you are sinning if you go ahead and do it. Did you hear that? Put in whatever you want there. If you have doubts about drinking that drink, watching that movie, listening to that music, if you have doubts about that, he says, it would be better off you didn't do that. Because if you do that, violating your conscience, then you have in fact sinned. That's what he says. It isn't the act itself. It's the violation of the conscience then that becomes the sin. He says, for you are not following your convictions. If you do anything you believe is not right, you are sinning. And so that puts this incredible responsibility on us now, me as a believer. Because now I'm responsible if I lead you to make that decision. So if I take some act of personal liberty and I exercise that personal liberty, and you convinced that what I'm doing is a sin, but you see the preacher doing it, and so you take part in it too, and yet in your heart and soul you still believe it's a sin, whether it's a sin or not, you have in fact sinned. And I have led you into that sin. I have contributed to that. I've been the stumbling block. And so a believer that causes another believer to violate their personal conscience has also sinned. It's not just the sin of the person whose conscience is violated, but it is the sin of the person who has led them into that. And so how do we work through this? How do we navigate this in our life? Because this is, the hard part isn't deciding whether or not this is an element of Christian liberty. The hard part is, how do I make sure I'm not causing other people to stumble? How to make sure that I'm not tripping other people up by the choices that I make? And the key, I believe, is found in this, and it is that we successfully live out our Christian liberty when we live selflessly. When we don't look at those things about what I should or shouldn't do and think, you know what, I enjoy this and I think this is beneficial. I think this is within my Christian liberty. If we do that without any regard to what impact it might have on somebody else, then we're in a dangerous area. And so what do we do about that? Well, what does Paul do about that? He says, you know what? If I'm risking making somebody stumble by eating a piece of meat, then I won't eat a piece of meat. Or maybe we would even say it this way. If eating a piece of meat out in public is going to cause somebody to stumble, then I'm just going to eat my piece of meat at home. Whatever it is that you want to plug in there. But I'm not going to do this in a way that is public and proclaims to other people what I believe. But I'm going to, in this area of personal liberty, I'm going to keep this between me and the Lord. And I don't believe that's sinful. It is sinful when we lead somebody to do something they believe to be sin. And so we live selflessly. We don't put our priorities first. We don't put what we want first, but we trust and allow God to make that to make that call in our life. And so living selflessly, putting other people's needs above ourselves, is the greatest means to live out our Christian liberty in a way that is fully endorsed by God, in a way that is not going to be a hindrance to somebody else in our life.